Chapter 4, Apologetics. Pre-Adamism and the Harmony of Science and Religion. As the 19th century dawned, the sense that strategies needed to be developed to keep scientific findings and religious faith in tandem gripped more and more minds. Challenges from geology, ethnology, and philology, supplemented later by the yet more dramatic gauntlet thrown down by the Darwinians, encouraged the cultivation of harmonizing tactics. Among these the postulation of a pre-Adamite world, sometimes inhabited by human or human-like creatures, sometimes not, began to attract an increasing coterie of advocates. Pre-Adamite vocabulary thus obtruded with increasing frequency into the dialogue between scientific theory and religious conviction. Some of these occurrences connected the pre-Adamite device to matters of racial difference, others only touched on racial implications, though a later generation, as we will see, would muster their conjectures in the cause of supremacist politics. Either way, the suspicion spread that there was an ever-growing need to find ways of reading the Bible so as to accommodate the findings and speculations of science, and pre-Adamite talk was one way of dealing with the problem. The very idea that had originated in skepticism and had provided sustenance to those radicals who sought to exploit the cracks beginning to appear in the canon was now beginning to be harnessed for the purpose of protecting the Bible from the results of infidel science. As Edward King announced at the very birth of the new century, interpreters of the Bible should carefully avoid rashness and examine most inquisitively what really is, or is not declared therein, using exceeding great caution that we may not be misled by any prejudices and mistakes, however riveted, by long prescription and timid allowance. This declaration appeared in an addendum to the second edition of King's Morsels of Criticism, which had first appeared in 1788, which was specifically dedicated to the task of showing, as its title page advertised, the most perfect consistency of philosophical discoveries, and of historical facts, with the Holy Scriptures. In particular, he was aware that the traditional story of universal human descent from Adam had caused a great many stumbling blocks to be laid in the way of those who wished to understand the sacred writings, and he insisted that the received doctrine was far from being really founded on Scripture. His own course of action was to point out that the Genesis narrative housed two quite different creation stories, the first dealing with humankind in general, the second with an individual, Adam. This realization provided one of many proofs and arguments that may be derived from the Holy Scriptures themselves, which tend to show that the commonly received opinion, that all mankind are the sons of Adam, is directly contrary to what is contained there. Such hermeneutic maneuvers opened up the possibility of there having been other inhabited regions of the earth at the time of the Mosaic story and thus removed any need to believe that the Kangaroo, for instance, or certain other strange animals of Africa, and of America, were in the ark with Noah. It was the same with very noxious animals, such as serpents, and toads, and most venomous snakes, of such kinds as have never been met with in Armenia, Mesopotamia, Syria, or indeed in any part of Asia. The point of the whole exercise was to take away at once all grounds of those taunting scoffs, and mockings of blasphemers, that have been the disgrace of all ages, and at the same time to remove many of the difficulties of the natural historian. In one way or another, then, pre-Adamite speculations were increasingly evident in works that sought to retain harmony between science and Scripture. Pre-Adamite worlds. During the early decades of the 19th century, traditional understandings of the Mosaic cosmogony had come under increasing strain from the encounter with new geological data. An ever-expanding time frame put more and more pressure on standard chronologies of the Earth, and a growing fascination with deep time fostered by visual representations of primitive life forms raised the public's consciousness of a distant primeval world. Engravings and illustrations, together with the famed models of dinosaurs erected in Crystal Palace, which were opened to the public in 1854, raised in some minds the question of why so much history had elapsed before the appearance of the crowning glory of creation, the human race. Commenting on this pre-Adamite world, one observer gave voice to the strangeness of the fact that myriads of creatures should have existed, and that generation after generation should have lived and died and passed away, ere yet man saw the light. The need to find some rationale for this state of affairs gripped the pens of theological writers. The primeval earth. Among those to take up this precise challenge was John Harris, a Congregationalist clergyman and, from 1838, president of Cheshunt College in Hertfordshire. Subsequently, after the amalgamation of several independent colleges, he assumed the principalship in 1851 of New College, London, another Congregationalist institution. As the title of his 1846 volume makes clear, his pre-Adamite earth mobilized ideas about pre-Adamic geology as a set of contributions to theological science. A popular author, he published on both metaphysical theology and the importance of clerical education. The Pre-Adamite Earth was a substantial philosophical essay in which he sought to establish a workable relationship between theology and the emerging sciences of the earth. The whole treatise was erected on teleological foundations and showed Harris's familiarity with a wide range of scientific writers, including John Herschel, William Whewell, Jean-Baptiste Lamarck, Pierre-Simon Laplace, Hugh Miller, and Alexander von Humboldt. His treatment of the subject revealed him to be profoundly antipathetic to the new evolutionary speculations emanating both from France and from the recently published, anonymous vestiges of the natural history of creation. Certainly, he defended the notion of development in Earth history, but it was a creationist progression and emphatically not the wild speculation, reckless alike of inductive facts and of moral consequences, being promulgated by those advocating radical evolutionary continuities. That fanciful hypothesis, he quipped, was contradicted at every step. But he was persuaded nonetheless of a lengthy geological history and considered it his task to elucidate how the development of the Earth constituted an extended preparation for its later human occupants. A good deal of time was spent on demonstrating to his own satisfaction the intellectual coherence of a pre-Adamite world essentially anticipating the subsequent Adamic drama and thus playing out what he called the law of progression. In analyzing the geological strata, observers were looking on the successive steps of a scene preparatory for a new stage of the divine plan. The inorganic world was designed by the divine creator to become the scene of organic forms, of life. Packing all of geological history into the first verse of the book of Genesis enabled Harris to leave the subsequent six-day creation story literally intact. To him a pre-Adamite cosmos predated the creation narrative, and it was a world restricted to pre-human inorganic and organic nature. In pursuing this strategy, of course, Harris was simply revisiting a scheme that had been in favor among a number of geological writers for quite some time. The Scottish evangelical intellectual Thomas Chalmers, for example, had been telling his followers at least since 1814 that a gap of as yet unspecified time, into which global geological history could be squeezed, existed between the initial act of creation and the point where the Genesis account takes up the story. The vast temporal possibilities that his gap theory opened up were matched by the limitless spatial extension that he meditated on in a series of astronomical discourses that showed his theological enthusiasm for a plurality of worlds inhabited by divinely created beings. By the end of that same decade the Oxford geologist William Buckland had adopted the same harmonizing system and later, in his 1836 Bridgewater Treatise, supplemented the argument with linguistic evidence from Hebrew that he had gleaned from the biblical scholar E.B. Pusey. Where Harris went beyond these standard concordist schemes was in his attempt to craft a metaphysics capable of mounting a robust defense of the idea that pre-Adamite Earth history was orchestrated by the Creator to be the theater for human occupancy. 3 years later, in 1849, when Harris brought out Man Primeval, he reconfirmed these convictions and defended the traditional Adamic six-day creation as part of another metaphysically inclined excursus, this time concentrated on the essential nature of the human constitution. Man was not made for the earth, he proclaimed in his opening sentence. The earth, from the first, had been preparing for man, and we are to suppose that now, at length, the hour of his creation had arrived. His self-appointed duty in this text was to elucidate the essence of human nature. Understanding, reason, imagination, emotion, conscience, language, these were the lenses through which the human subject should be investigated. Here he paused to reflect on the whole question of the unity of the human species and reviewed the polygenetic proposals that were on offer, making use of the critique advanced by physical anthropologists such as Johann Friedrich Blumenbach and James Cowles Pritchard and philologists such as Bunsen, all of whom defended the unity of the human race. And while he dispassionately reviewed the polygamist case and acknowledged that the identity of humanity cannot be regarded as dependent on, or necessitated by, an identity in the original means of production, he was of the opinion that the doctrine that all the families of mankind have actually descended from a single pair, appears to be taught in the account of the Adamic creation. Experience confirmed the verdict. For even the most dissimilar races, he judged, are found to be psychologically identical. Tribes rashly proscribed as on a level with the brute, have in our own day vindicated their claim to a common humanity. The metropolis of civilization is not without its degraded bushmen. As far as we know, no race of men stands in intellectual or moral isolation. His conclusion was thus crystal clear: all the branches of evidence appropriate to the inquiry support each other, and unite in authenticating the conclusion that the human species is one, and that all the differences which it exhibits are to be regarded merely as varieties. To Harris, in sum, the designation pre-Adamite was no more than an adjectival description of the primeval earth prior to the advent of the human species, whose genesis was recorded in the Mosaic story of Adam. Certainly, He emphasized the significance of progression in creation, but he resisted any recasting of such a trajectory in terms of evolutionary transformism. The development of which we speak, he insisted, is not of one thing from another, but of the divine plan of creation, and of our conceptions of that plan. Reviewers agreed. 1. Writing from Columbia, South Carolina, waxed lyrical with enthusiasm for Harris's sound logic, lucid reasoning, great research, systematized facts, and well-digested science, even while abominating the development hypothesis, the most dangerous form of modern infidelity. To this commentator, Harris had done a superlative job in showing that Christian culture had nothing to fear from the science of geology. And indeed, the writer did not miss the opportunity that Harris's pre-Adamite earth afforded for pressing for the teaching of natural history in his own state and bemoaning its absence in particular from the South Carolina College. Another anonymous writer concurred and, after delivering a thumbnail sketch of the various strata that constituted the pre-Adamite world, noted that because geology had contributed incalculably to the comforts of life, the government of every civilized country has been employing geologists to explore its territory. Plainly, writers supportive of geological revelations about deep time found talk of a pre-Adamic Earth history attractive not only because it allowed them the opportunity to tell religious believers that they had nothing to fear from this branch of science, but also because it rendered the subject safe for inclusion in college curricula. The idea of an uninhabited pre-Adamite Earth continued to show up amongst religious writers wanting to retain a traditional interpretation of the days of creation and yet allow for a lengthy global history. This was the case, for example, with Herbert William Morris, described as Professor of Mathematics at Newington Collegiate Institute, London, who addressed the issue in the final decades of the 19th century. Morris adhered to a literal reading of the days of creation and put forth his views in an 1871 volume on Science and the Bible, or, The Mosaic Creation and Modern Discoveries, subsequently reprinted in Britain under the title Work Days of Creation, and then in an 1885 work, Present Conflict of Science with the Christian Religion. In 1890 he brought out a second edition of the first of these works, noting in the new preface that he had added a large amount of new and interesting matter, particularly respecting the pre-Adamite history of the Earth, its numerous and surprising revolutions of continents and oceans, the deposition of iron, coal, and salt rocks, its mysterious changes of climate, the cold and submergence and desolation of the glacial period, and the beneficial results these were designed to work out. All of the geological periods, the Laurentian, Cambrian, Silurian, Carboniferous, Permian, Triassic, Jurassic, and so on, were identified and relegated to the pre-Adamite Earth, and Morris provided his readers with luscious engravings to shape their imaginations of a lost primeval cosmos that had sunk into chaos between the first two verses of the Bible. Here, then, is a hiatus, a vast gap, in the Mosaic narrative, Morris told his readers, which it is important to observe. Between the creation of the earth, as stated in the first verse, and the condition in which it is found and described, in the second verse, there must have elapsed a long and indefinite period of time. Creation and ruin and restoration and recreation, this was the sequence through which the globe had passed. As with Harris, Morris's pre-Adamite world was devoid of human beings and prefatory to the literal six-day set of creative transformations that was recorded in the Mosaic account. Hints of a primordial race. Other writers concerned to keep Genesis and geology in harmony, however, were less sure that the pre-Adamite Earth was free of human-like inhabitants, and the idea of pre-Adamite races, of one sort or another, began to attract supporters. John Thomas, for example, one of the founders of the religious sect known as the Christadelphians, an anti-Trinitarian, millenarian, Protestant group without an ordained clergy, used the idea of pre-Adamites specifically as a means of accommodating a long earth history. In his Elpis Israel, The Hope of Israel, one of the founding documents of the denomination, written in 1849, he advanced the view that there are hints, casually dropped in the scriptures, which would seem to indicate that our planet was inhabited by a race of beings anterior to the formation of man and that these pre-Adameral inhabitants were to be understood as fallen angels. These beings were subject to the total wreck of their abode, and their entire submergence, with all the mammoths of their estate, under the waters of an overwhelming flood reduced the earth to the formless emptiness that readers encountered in the first verses of the Bible. The possibilities of this conjectural prehistory for understanding recent geological revelations was clear. Fragments of the wreck of this pre-Adameral world have been brought to light by geological research, to the records of which we refer the reader, for a detailed account of its discoveries, with this remark, that its organic remains, coalfields, and strata, belong to the ages before the formation of man, rather than to the era of the creation, or the Noahic flood. This view of the matter will remove a host of difficulties, which have hitherto disturbed the harmony between the conclusions of geologists and the Mosaic account of the physical constitution of our globe. Geologists have endeavored to extend the 6 days into 6,000 years. But this, with the scriptural data we have adduced, is quite unnecessary. Instead of 6,000, they can avail themselves of 60,000, for the scriptures reveal no length of time during which the terrene angels dwelt on our globe. Again, the numismatist and Anglican clergyman Henry Christmas in 1850 that there might well have been pre-Adamic people and that acknowledgement of their existence provided a suitable way of coping with geological time. Editor of several Anglican periodicals and author of works on theological and historical geographical subjects, he contributed numerous pieces to the Numismatic Chronicle and enjoyed fellowship of the Royal Society. Christmas's Echoes of the Universe, which began as a series of lectures to young Anglicans, was intended to buttress the connection between human science and divine truth. In the fourth of these excursions, Christmas turned to the task of seeking to make the discoveries of modern geologists tally with the account given in the Book of Holy Writ, supportively quoting the contributions made in Harris's Pre-Adamite Earth. His approach was anticipative. It sketched out a possible theory of early times that could be called upon to meet the challenge forthcoming from recent scientific advances. Evidence of geological time, together with the old challenge from Chinese chronology, pressed him to consider the possibility that the early Genesis narrative incorporated two accounts and that the former referred to a previous creation. This pre-Adamic world, in turn, was subject to some great convulsion that cleared away the debris of a former race, thereby preparing the globe for that which we now behold. In earlier times among the antediluvians themselves there were traditions concerning races of men in existence before Adam, and this in itself, Christmas observed, provided grounds for that theory which we have laid before the reader. To be sure, there were difficulties in the way of such a reading, not least over the whole question of death as a consequence of Adam's fall, and Christmas devoted some energies to establishing that mortality was actually a condition of creation. But there he left the matter, as a potential means of keeping science and religion in harmony. Isabel Duncan's conjecture. For all the rather fleeting suggestions that a pre-Adamite world could rescue the Bible from the assaults of the geological column, the most sustained prosecution of such a scheme appeared in 1860, in an idiosyncratic theological oddity sharing diagnostic features with the version tersely sketched by John Thomas in Elpis Israel. Initially anonymous, Pre-Adamite Man, or, The Story of Our Old Planet and Its Inhabitants was the work of Isabel, sometimes Isabella, Duncan. Within the previous year or two, evidence of human artifacts in strata with long-extinct animals had been excavated at Brixham Cave, and these findings brought into sharper focus the archaeological questions that had earlier been raised with Jacques Boucher de Perthes's Antiquité Celtique et Antediluvienne of 1847. Developments of this stripe posed new questions for Bible readers, and Duncan's book was one of the earliest, from an evangelical standpoint, to try to address the issue. Throughout it she demonstrated considerable familiarity with the works of natural scientists, including David Thomas Ansted, William Buckland, Jacques Boucher de Perthes, Alcide d'Orbigny, Charles Darwin, William Herschel, Gideon Mantell, Roderick Murchison, Adam Sedgwick, and William Whewell, and showed evidence of visits to a number of key geological and archaeological sites. Her strategy was to discriminate vigorously between the two creation stories and Genesis, not as two versions of the same event but as records of two separate creations. Distinguishing between these two narratives and identifying their discrepancies, of course, was already part of the stock and trade of higher critics, particularly in Germany, who attributed them to different ancient sources brought together by a redactor. But Duncan had no critical purpose in mind. She wanted to preserve the accuracy of Scripture and to bring forward a proposal for reconciling the two accounts so as to achieve, as she put it, harmony between the Bible and the rocks and, therefore, a better and truer understanding of the inspired record. Her answer? Two creations, one pre-Adamite, the other Adamite. This line of attack, she conceded, bore some resemblance to that of Isaac de Peyrier, but the similarities were so superficial, she insisted, as to bear not the remotest analogy to the views which the writer has ventured to propound. And indeed, there were crucial differences. For Duncan there was no continuity between the pre-Adamite and Adamite worlds, matters of racial variation were of no importance in her account, and she vigorously opposed the polygonism of the Peyrerian arrangement in an effort to develop a more theologically conservative rendering. In other respects the work followed the concordist tactics of other apologists, not least in backing the idea that the Genesis days, of the first creation account, correlated with geological epochs. As she herself put it, the 6 days of creation were in fact 6 ages, or cycles of ages, and numerous exegetical problems evaporated when we adopt the idea suggested by several modern geologists, and acquiesced in by Dr. Chalmers, Pye Smith, and Hugh Miller, that the events of creation must have passed in 6 successive visions before the mind of Moses. But the radical chasm that Duncan proposed between the pre- and post-Adamic worlds when she illustrated the differences between these two phases of Earth history has been interpreted as one of the very first recognitions of geological sequencing in the pictorial genre of depicting extinct fauna. Her use of a fold-out panorama of the different worlds of the pre-Adamite and the Adamite etched by W. R. Woods, as Martin Rudwick observes, broke the standard mold by suggesting a sequence in deep time. Her visualization was a 4-part composition, with the lowest layer showing reptiles, the platform above amalgamating mammals from various stages of the Tertiary, including the great Irish elk, the third tier disclosing the lifeless icy world inspired by Agassiz's glacial theory, and finally, on top, the Adamic world of modern creatures, with the pyramids rising in the far distance. The icy desolation that Duncan interjected between Adam's world and that of its earlier inhabitants enabled her to accept both the existence of a pre-Adamite humanity and to adopt a monogenetic account of the descent of modern humans. In so doing, she was certain that the doctrinal orthodoxy of her own proposals was well and truly secured. Nevertheless, it was clear that for Duncan the Earth had been host to a human race before Adam, with a history that had run its course prior to the appearance of the Adamic family and which had experienced its own fall from perfection, a fall correlated with worldwide geological disruption. It was into this chaotic wasteland that the new Eden was inserted, a little spot of perfection that had been retrieved by special providence from the ruin that still pervaded the world. Perfect, yes, but narrowly circumscribed. Adam enjoyed nothing of the worldwide empire that his pre-Adamite forebears had for their pleasure and delight. Pre-Adamite man's novelty with respect to its graphic portrayal of discrete phases in Earth history, however, was nothing compared to the eccentricity it advanced in its later pages. As Stephen Jay Gould pointed out in an examination, composed in his own inimitable style, of Duncan's work, unambiguous evidence of human remains would not be located until 1891, when Eugène Dubois unearthed the remains of Homo erectus in Java, and in an attempt to account for the presence of remnants of human stone tools, but the absence of human bones in the fossil record, she proposed what he called a stunning solution to her greatest conundrum. Her question: we have the bones of the lower animals in abundance in the rocks of their respective eras, where are those of the pre-Adamites? Her answer: the pre-Adamites had been bodily resurrected to become the angel host, whose mysterious visits to our world are so often recorded in the Bible, whose origin is so obscure, whose relations to Adam's family are so close, yet so unexplained. From that point Duncan's book turned into a discourse on angelology, their pre-Adamite status, their relationship to the departed, and their connection to human history. Not surprisingly, in Gould's view Duncan's geological representations emerge not as a contribution to scientific innovation but as a theological scenario for Earth's history in the pre-Adamite tradition of textual analysis. The key white strip of Agassiz's ice-covered world may be validated by geological science, but this catastrophe represents, for Duncan, the agency of God's wrath after the satanic group of pre-Adamites fell from grace. Nevertheless, the geological detail in her reconstruction provided readers with a pretty good review of the scientific evidence for an ancient world. Thanks to the painstaking researches of Stephen Snoblin, the hitherto elusive circumstances surrounding the publication of Duncan's Pre-Adamite Man, the potential ambiguities in its authorship, given its initial anonymity, the editorial involvement of Isabel's husband, Reverend George Duncan, and its reception in the popular press have all been uncovered. Published at the very time, during the winter of 1859-60, when Darwin's Origin of Species and Essays and Reviews made their appearance, and when human artifacts coexistent with extinct animals were being uncovered, Pre-Adamite Man enjoyed considerable popularity, quickly going through several editions. Its reception was mixed, ranging from enthusiasm to ridicule. Thus, while the Morning Advertiser found much ingenuity in the book, the Athenaeum mercilessly satirized it, and whereas the Illustrated News of the World judged that it would create as much of a stir as Vestiges, not least on account of its frank modesty which immediately wins the reader's favor, the Morning Post was scathing in accusing its author of engaging in nothing less than the perversion of Scripture. Snoblin's account, moreover, tellingly locates Duncan's evangelical apologetics, however fanciful it might seem to modern eyes, in the context of biblicist attempts to come to terms with recent archaeological revelations. He identifies, in its presentation of an Eden before Eden, a fertile paradise unencumbered with sin, civilization or war, a kind of myth-making eschatological romance in reverse, a future paradise projected into the past. Crucially, too, he perceives that Duncan's treatise should be seen as an inherently conservative theological work, the radical early history of pre-Adamism notwithstanding, and that her genius lies in her thorough conversion and baptism of a theory with skeptical origins. In Duncan, the migration of pre-Adamism from heresy to orthodoxy, from skepticism to apologetics, was now underway. Gall's projections. Whereas Duncan divined angelic agents behind pre-Adamite artifacts, Reverend James Gall assigned them a very different identity. Gall, a Church of Scotland minister and founder of an interdenominational mission in Edinburgh, has achieved fame for his cartographic endeavors, celestial and terrestrial. In an attempt to provide a graphic portrayal of the heavenly bodies, he devised a number of map projections, which he also applied to the Earth's surface. One of these, the Gall orthographic projection, originally put forward at the 1855 meeting of the British Association for the Advancement of Science, was an equal area projection that reduced the polar distortion inherent in the standard Mercator map. Reinvented by Arno Peters, who publicized it in the 1960s, it became stunningly popular and nowadays is often used to dramatize the extensive land area of the Third World. Gall's significance in our story, however, springs from a somewhat different set of preoccupations, a concern with harmonizing science and religion. And here, too, the idea of Adamic forebears came to the rescue. In Primeval Man Unveiled, a work that further expanded suggestions he had put forward in The Stars and the Angels, Gall sought ways of accommodating traditional faith to both geology and Darwinian evolution in such a way as to keep intact the long-standing compatibility of the Book of Nature and the Book of Scripture. The key, he believed, lay in rethinking the authorship of the Genesis narrative, and he argued in some detail for the view that Moses had put together documents from earlier witnesses, Noah, Seth, and Adam himself. This led him to distinguish, as others were doing, between the two creation narratives of Genesis chapters 1 and 2, to describe the first of these as an apocalypse, and to identify the second as history. The purpose of the latter was to describe the creation of an individual Adam, the first of the Messianic race. It was the story of the inauguration of the line through which the Messiah would come. The former account, or what he called the natural history of the universe, was an apocalyptic rendering of the creation, through the agency of natural law, of a world that had fallen into ruin through some global catastrophe. This primitive world was an inhabited one, and the remains that archaeologists were uncovering were those of a previous population of our globe. The existence of these pre-Adamites, who had been swept from the planet prior to the coming of Adam, provided Gall with a via media between the polygonists who spoke of several Adams, a white Adam, and a black Adam, a red Adam and a yellow Adam, and those monogenists who, while maintaining the unity of the human race through their common descent from Adam, had to push his creation so far back in time to accommodate the dating of fossil remains being excavated in Denmark, Egypt, and America as to subvert the integrity of biblical chronology. The pre-Adamites allowed him to keep to a traditional chronology and retain the unity of the race. Thus far Gall's account paralleled Isabel Duncan's in several crucial respects, not least in postulating that the pre-Adamites had become extinct thousands of years before the time of Adam, but he went out of his way in the preface to insist that there was in fact very little similarity between his views and hers. The reason, it seems, was to do with the identity of the pre-Adamites. The savage state of society that he believed was indicated by the archaeological record, and indeed was in keeping with the theory of gradual development, indicated a degraded race much different both from Adam's original perfection and from Duncan's angelic residents. To Gall it simply pointed to a botched humanity under the influence of satanic forces, their lingering spiritual malevolence and the remains of their material bodies, which have been found in Denmark, England, and France together attested to the degeneracy at which they had arrived before they became altogether extinct. From that point in the narrative Gall strayed off into a variety of spiritualist themes about the character of satanic forces, magical practices, and the identity of the Antichrist. These preoccupations disclose the context in which his postulation of pre-Adamites was domiciled, namely, as a biblicist device to retain primitive supernaturalism and yet keep faith with the revelations of geological and archaeological science. Snatches of similar pre-Adamites were also fleetingly glimpsed by other writers. George Hawkins Pember, for example, a champion of the gap theory, told the readers of his Earth's earliest ages in 1876 of pre-Adamite beings whose absence from the fossil record might be on account of their bodies being resolved into primal elements or that death did not touch these primeval men until a final destruction prior to the creation of Adam. The parallel with Gall's proposals are evident. To Pember the pre-Adamites were called upon both to remove some of the geological and other difficulties usually associated with the commencing verses of Genesis and, perhaps even more so, to provide an explanation for the origin of supernatural agents. Demons, he speculated, might well be the spirits of those who trod this earth in the flesh before the ruin described in the second verse of Genesis. For Pember, it seems, pre-Adamite beings occupied a necessary niche in the ontology of a former world, the remnants of which were detectable in the geological strata. The racial fixations that frequently dominated pre-Adamite schemes, it is clear, are conspicuously absent from these advocates of pre-Adamite humanity. Their concern was apologetic, it was designed to uphold harmony between science and theology. Indeed, 20th-century fundamentalists have continued to resort explicitly to the speculations of both Duncan and Gall in their attempts to reconcile the Genesis story with scientific developments. Nevertheless, a substantial body of pre-Adamite writing was used, as we will continue to observe, in the service of racial politics and as an explanation for human variability. Human diversity and pre-Adamite apologetics. Just as the pre-Adamites were resorted to as a means of keeping faith with both earth science and the Old Testament scriptures, they were no less called upon to explain those racial differences and distributions that students of anthropology and biogeography fastened upon. Certainly, critical voices could be heard from those intent on retaining traditional Mosaic monogenism. The physician and linguist John Mason Good, for example, shielded the biblical account from the critique of the celebrated Isaac Pereira in his lecture, later published as On the Varieties of the Human Race, which was delivered as part of a three-course series at Surrey Institution in 1811-12. A Fellow of the Royal Society and man of letters, he rejected the Pereirian speculation that the Mosaic narrative contained accounts of two separate human creations and provided, to his own satisfaction at least, answers to the sorts of conundrum that La Pereire had presented to conventional interpretations. In response to the old chestnut about who peopled Cain's world, for instance, Good considered that because the first fall of man did not take place till 129 years after the creation of Adam, there was ample time, especially if we take into consideration the peculiar fecundity of both animals and vegetables in their primeval state, for a multiplication of the race of man, to the extent of many thousand souls. Besides this, he was sure that students of human variety had made much too much of anatomical differences between the races, they were just far too inclined to generalize from rare occurrences. Merely expounding their claims, he felt, was sufficient to show the absurdity of the argument for a plurality of human stocks or species. Their altogether superficial arguments were not more than skin-deep. With Montesquieu he attributed diversity to the effects of climate, diet, and manners, to which he added morbid and hereditary affection. Natural histories of the human species and centers of creation. Notwithstanding such censure, pre-Adamism became increasingly evident among writers who directed their attention to ethnological subjects. William Frederick Van Omrenge, for example, protested the doctrinal propriety of polygenetic pre-Adamism in his 1848 investigation of the theories of the natural history of man. In this work he was cautious, however, not to commit himself explicitly to the pre-Adamite scheme but was at pains all the while to insist that if the conjectures of the most recent physiological anthropologists were to be verified, any theological shock waves could easily be absorbed. This was a line of attack that became increasingly popular among Orthodox Christian apologists. Indeed, Van Omrenge had the suspicion that the Mosaic history sat rather well with the presumption of multiple human species of different creative origins. The testimony of the Genesis narrative was just too fragmentary, he felt, and all sorts of long-standing questions about Cain and his city were left unanswered. All of these problems evaporated with the coming of La Pereire's pre-Adamite. Here the concern was to find ways of keeping the most recent physiological and anthropological findings consistent with Scripture. Emphatically more partisan, and indeed decidedly more racist, were the articles published a couple of years later by the eminent Swiss naturalist at Harvard Louis Agassiz. In two papers published in the Christian Examiner for 1850, Agassiz took up the issue of animal and human geographical distributions. His argument was simple: there were distinct zoological zones or provinces, an Arctic, a European temperate, an African, a tropical Asiatic, and so on, in which the Creator had placed discrete species. Agassiz's idealist nature philosophy encouraged him to consider that each race had a separate point of origin and that any blurring of its transcendental individuality was both biologically and socially repugnant. Not only had animals and plants originated in centers of creation across the globe, but they remained within fixed bounds in their geographical distribution. Simply put, races were made for places. But Agassiz's arguments did not stop with his interpretation of the natural history of the globe's inhabitants. He was no less concerned to demonstrate the doctrinal propriety of his polygamist message. He thus began his two-part series for that Boston Unitarian Journal by arguing that the traditional monogenetic account of origins was a very modern invention not to be found in the book of Genesis. To the contrary, that Adam and Eve were neither the only nor the first human beings created as intimated in the statement of Moses himself, where Cain is represented to us as wandering among foreign nations after he was cursed. Thus we maintain that the view of mankind as originating from a single pair, Adam and Eve, is neither a biblical view nor a correct view, nor one agreeing with the results of science. Moreover, the view that the Creator only produced one pair of each animal species ran into the knotty problem that the primitive pair of lions would have had to abstain from food until the gazelles and other antelopes had sufficiently multiplied to preserve their races from the persecution of these ferocious beasts. One lion breakfast would have wiped out a whole species. Presumably, Adam's daily diet, too, would have rapidly resulted in mass extinction. As for humanity, Agassiz insisted, mankind cannot have originated in single individuals, but must have been created in that numeric harmony which is characteristic of each species. Men must have originated as nations, as the bees have originated in swarms. Despite his self-conscious disavowal of any interest in political matters or in justifying slavery, the racial bias that Agassiz happily exhibited in his portrayal of the different racial types, he found in African races a peculiar apathy, a peculiar indifference to the advantages afforded by civilized society reinforced the earlier pluralist arguments of figures such as Charles Caldwell and Samuel George Morton, who vigorously promoted the multiple origins of humanity. Soon talk of separate beginnings would be aggressively taken up both by writers with little concern to reconcile science and religion as well as by those who cultivated a white supremacist theology. For the meantime our focus remains on those who, even if their work exhibited racial overtones, showed some apologetic concern with retaining concord between anthropology and the Bible. Thus, Agassiz devoted his energies to arguing that the unity of mankind does not imply a community of origin for men. We believe, on the contrary, that a higher view of mankind can be taken than that which is derived from a mere sensual connection, that we need not search for the highest bond of humanity in a mere animal function, whereby we are most closely related to the brutes. Spiritualizing all allowed for bestializing some. Needless to say, Agassiz's proposals were not universally welcomed by theological commentators. W. H. Moore, a Presbyterian minister from Richmond, Virginia, excoriated both Agassiz and his polygynist predecessors. Anthropological theorists who were forever going on about the parallels between apes and races, he noted wryly, had been inclined, with all due magnanimity and abnegation, to generously disclaim the honor of this simial relationship, and benevolently bestow it upon poor Quashy. 79 to Moore. The difference between the fairest Caucasian and the sootiest African, is not nearly so great as that between the little, shaggy Shetland pony, and the gigantic dray horse of London, and Agassiz's attempt to enlist the Bible in his cause of different human species was odious. We would be glad to know, Moore sniped, how he has discovered that Adam and Noah belonged to the white race at all. In all there was to Moore something utterly cold-blooded in Agassiz's haughty assignment of more than half the human race to a doom of hopeless, irreversible degradation. Others, by contrast, protested the doctrinal appropriateness of Agassiz's polygonism. Both it and the pre-Adamism of La Peyrère, for example, were defended by the Boston Unitarian minister N. L. Frothingham, also writing in the Christian Examiner the year following the appearance of Agassiz's pair of articles. Even while affecting agnosticism on the whole subject, Frothingham exploited Agassiz's recent intervention in three conspicuous ways. First, he used the occasion of Agassiz's multiple Adamite proposals to castigate those whose theological attachments stood in the way of intellectual freedom. Yet he was glad to report that there had been remarkably little acrimonious comment on Agassiz's essays, a condition he attributed to an increased and welcome freedom of philosophical inquiry. Nevertheless, he warned of the dangers of those who would cast reproach or suspicion upon an investigation in the Department of Zoology, or Ethnology in the name of divine truth, and urged that in no case whatever, and in no degree whatever, should the student of physical science be checked or limited in his inquiries by the supposed authority of any ancient writing, however sacred. Calling readers' attention to Galileo's fate, he cautioned against efforts to repress anthropological inquiry in the name of orthodoxy. Second, he took the opportunity that Agassiz had afforded to attack the idea of the plenary inspiration of Scripture and to liberalize exegesis of doctrines such as that of the fallen ways that facilitated pre-Adamite humanity. Indeed, it was clear to him that adopting pre-Adamism necessarily rubbed Augustinian theology the wrong way, not least in its understanding of Adam's headship of all humanity. But that caused him no concern. For Frothingham, hermeneutics should be practiced in the light and height of biblical freedom, and not by the smoky lamp of a scholastic dogmatism. Third, he He happily exploited Agassiz's exposition to rehearse in considerable detail, both biographical and theological, the original pre-Adamite scheme of La Peyrère, and to record his admiration of this learned and ingenious man whatever his shortcomings, as an exegete. Frothingham found La Peyrère frequently original, far-sighted, modestly bold. His book abounds with wise, sober views of Scripture story, that surprise us with their superiority to the current religious notions of even our own times. Also in that same year, 1851, Samuel Kneeland, a Boston medical naturalist and polygonist, found much to commend in the arguments of both Van Amerongen and Agassiz in an 84-page introduction to the American edition of the Natural History of the Human Species, a work first published in 1848 by Lieutenant Colonel Charles Hamilton Smith. An amateur naturalist and solider, Smith produced numerous works on natural history, which he illustrated with his own watercolors, and this particular volume allowed him considerable scope to demonstrate his qualities as a draftsman through his depictions of typical human head forms, cranial structure, and eye forms. Here he cautiously kept open the monogenist polygonist matter. It remained, he said, a question in systematic zoology, whether mankind is wholly derived from a single species, or produced by the hand of nature at different epochs. But the whole tenor of the work was polygonist, as he specified the centers of existence of the three typical forms of man: the intertropical region of Africa, for the woolly-haired, the open elevated regions of northeastern Asia for the beardless, and the mountain ranges towards the south and west for the bearded Caucasian. In three different geographical locations the three typical human stocks had come into being, at different points in time. The most ancient was what he called the tropical type, the latest, the Caucasian. Indeed, he speculated that it was only when the other racial types fused with the Caucasian that they achieved the intellectual advancement that enabled them to attain the ultimate conditions for which man is created and thereby to display humanity's essential unity. What is notable is that Smith's entire inventory of the human species was charted without recourse either to biblical exegesis or to the significance of Adam, an account demonstrating that caution must be taken not to equate pre-Adamism as a theological construct with polygonism as an anthropological thesis. Nevertheless, Kneeland's lengthy introduction, it amounted to nearly a quarter the length of the whole book, did bring the American edition of Smith's compendium into the realm of theological dialogue. His declared intention was to present an even-handed overview of scientific works on race, but his judgments were ever biased toward polygonism and Agassiz-style creationism. And while he was quick to deplore as unscientific the way in which monogenists sought scriptural self-justification, he himself did not hesitate to assure his readers that the Bible was entirely compatible with multiple Adams. Thus, he complained that the language of Reverend Thomas Smith's Unity of the Human Race, which defended the idea that humans were descended from Adam, was more that of the polemic theologian, and the advocate of Southern institutions, than the scientific naturalist, and ethnologist, and, however appropriate in other places, is quite irrelevant on the subject of the origin of mankind. And yet he was at pains to insist in his attack on Pritchard's monogenism that there is no evidence that the sacred writers considered the colored races as descended from the same stock as themselves. This is a modern and human invention for political or other purposes. Such interventions routinely asserted themselves as Kneeland expounded the views of Agassiz and Van Amerongen. Were not many local centers of animal and vegetable creation most consistent with the wisdom of God? Was attributing racial differences to the accidents of climate not equivalent to making physical influences more powerful than the Creator? Did not the incompleteness and obscurity of the Mosaic account of man point unequivocally to a race of men independent of Adam? 94. Whether as an exercise in cultural apologetics or animated by a sense that if polygonism were to succeed, its doctrinal orthodoxy needed securing, by rhetorical gesture and partisan review, Kneeland did his best to domesticate human plurality to the religious ethos of his mid-19th century American audience. The Apologetics of Lane, McCausland, and Nemo. An even more concerted effort to render pre-Adamic polygonism congenial to Scripture appeared a few years later, in 1856, and in an enlarged edition in 1860, by the Arabic scholar and lexicographer Edward William Lane. Edited and introduced by his nephew, the distinguished British archaeologist and Orientalist Reginald Stuart Poole, head of the coin department at the British Museum and later Professor of Archaeology at University College, London. Lane's Genesis of the Earth and of Man aimed to do for anthropology and archaeology what Hugh Miller and Edward Hitchcock had already done for geology, namely, to show its profound compatibility with Christianity. Fundamentally, Lane was convinced that a much more sophisticated hermeneutic arsenal was needed to cope with the new threats to biblical orthodoxy, and he used his considerable expertise in Semitic languages to construct his edifice. This project, his nephew was not slow to point out, was exceptionally timely in the light of two prevailing circumstances. First, there were those who high-handedly dismissed scientific inquiry as false because it disagrees with their theological opinions. That irresponsible attitude was, Poole implied, characteristic of the Catholic Church. He hoped for better from our Protestant clergy, whose full acknowledgement of the sole authority of the Scriptures and the right of private judgment affirmed the two great principles upon which hinged the Reformation. Lane's pre-Adamism was thus staged as an essentially Protestant intervention. The second state of affairs had more clearly emerged from the shadows as the second edition of the book was going through the press. This was the re-emergence of the old battle between science and religion that had manifested itself dramatically at the 1860 meeting of the British Association for the Advancement of Science, the very meeting at which Huxley's infamous confrontation with Bishop Samuel Wilberforce reportedly took place. Given this situation, Lane's analysis was needed more than ever. Blending some fairly labyrinthine exegesis of various obscure passages in Genesis and displaying an awareness of recent trends in textual criticism and developments in the elucidation of ancient hieroglyphs, Lane urged his case for two separate human creations, one pre-Adamic, the other Adamic. The flint arrowheads currently being excavated in cave deposits from the Pliocene epoch, alongside teeth and bones of extinct species, were positive evidence that the origin of man is very far more ancient than it is commonly believed to be, and the only way of preserving biblical chronology was to attribute them to a pre-Adamite race. But crucially here, in contrast to the pre-Adamism of Duncan and Gall, Lane believed that pre-Adamite stock continued in existence during and after the time of Adam. Its members' blood ran in the veins of later post-Adamic generations. A certain amount of doctrinal architecture needed rearranging to cope with this proposal. Standard interpretations of the scope of the fall from grace, the inheritance of original sin, the theological ontology of death, the consanguinity of the human species in the absence of a common origin, and the demographic scope of the flood all required adjustment. And having addressed these to his own satisfaction, Lane pursued his task. In essence, he considered that the first creation of humans had taken place in the valley of the Upper Nile, from which location they diffused through Africa and Asia and branched out into a range of racial types. Much later the Adamite races, which he took to be Caucasian, were divinely created, and they intermarried with various pre-Adamite strains to produce the diversity of racial types that are extant today. This perspective not only provided an explanation of human racial differentiation, but it facilitated an Adamic chronology that was closely in keeping with a conservative genealogical time scale. For only by viewing Adam as a recent newcomer on the stage of human history could the authority of science and scripture remain unimpeached. As Lane put it, some men of science and learning, holding the common belief that Adam was the first of our species, have confessed themselves to be compelled, by geological and other considerations, to adopt the opinion that he was created 20,000 years, or more, before the Christian era, and the early biblical history has been enormously distorted to accommodate it to this belief. But our own opinion, that the Bible itself indicates the existence of pre-Adamites, relieves us from the necessity of requiring a more extended biblical chronology than that which appears to be advocated by most of the best judges in the present day. There is no doubt that a sense of racial superiority pervaded Lane's analysis. His supposition that the Caucasians alone are descended from Adam, his talk of the deterioration of Adamite blood, and his representation of Adamic degeneration through marriage with descendants of the primitive stock are indicative. It is therefore not surprising that the American polygamist and racial apologist George Gliddon soon approvingly and extensively quoted from Lane's work, observing that it augurs well for ethnological progress in Great Britain and pointing out that it continued the argument earlier put forward by La Peyrère. Yet taken overall, the thrust of Lane's account was decidedly more exegetical than racial in tone and more concerned with amalgamating data on a wide scale to support his conjecture. In this latter regard, his use of philological evidence to bolster his version of double Adamism is particularly conspicuous and was picked up in Poole's introductory editorial. Here Poole lambasted the monogenetic supposition underpinning Bunsen's linguistic archaeology as grounded on nothing more than mere sentimentality. Had it not been that Bunsen had started with this fixed persuasion, Poole quipped, his philology would have been entirely different. For his part, Lane launched his own attack on the Bunsen-Muller model of language development and, siding with Ernest Renan, advanced his own scheme, based on the discrimination of monosyllabic, agglutinate, and amalgamate forms. This approach ran counter to Bunsen and Muller's taxonomies, first, in representing the Semitic stock as in no way derived from a primeval language, and, second, in representing the Egyptian, which he terms Chamitism, or Chamitism, as being, from the first, collateral to the Semitic. The implications of this polygenetic taxonomy were, of course, obvious. There have existed pre-Adamites of our species. These beings spoke a primitive monosyllabic language that developed into early forms of agglutinate speech, perhaps akin to ancient Chinese, which in turn branched out along two separate axes, Nigrian and Turanian. Both monosyllabic and agglutinate forms had originated with artless, uncivilized, illiterate races. The Adamites, by contrast, were speakers of an amalgamate tongue, and their descendants were predominantly Caucasian. This contrast between earlier primitive and later complex languages had prompted Bunsen to discern an evolutionary descent of the latter from the former and a presumed monogenetic origin for language. Lane strenuously disagreed, perceiving no genealogical links between these linguistic systems and postulating a separate point of origin for each. A sequence of successive creations was being misread as development from a common origin. Bunsen and Muller's accounts, moreover, put unbearable pressure on the biblical documents, requiring a very extended chronology of the post-Adamic period and, Lane inferred, the reduction of a great part of the history of the Book of Genesis to the category of faulty and vague traditions. Both empirically and exegetically, the postulation of pre-Adamite languages seemed irresistible. Philologically, Adamic monogenism undermined biblical authority, pre-Adamite polygonism rescued it. As he explained, Bunsen and Muller's belief in the descent of all mankind from Adam demands concessions enormously at variance with the scripture history of the time anterior to the dispersion, unless we admit the evidences in favor of the existence of pre-Adamites presented by the Bible itself, and by physical and historical, as well as linguistic, facts. The question of language history also played a critical role in another work of pre-Adamite apologetic, Adam and the Adamite, which appeared in 1864 shortly after the second edition of Lane's volume. Its author, the Irish judge Dominic MacAusland, was by now Queen's Counsel and recently appointed Crown Prosecutor under the second administration of Lord Derby. MacAusland was the author of a number of successful religious works, and the tenor of this particular volume can be inferred from its subtitle, The Harmony of Scripture and Ethnology. The aim was simple, to uphold the detailed accuracy of Scripture in the face both of challenges from the human sciences and of the critical spirit of Bishop John William Colenso in Essays and Reviews. From the outset MacAusland freely admitted that the biblical text was not written to instruct us in the knowledge of the physical sciences. But this did not for a moment mean that science and Scripture dealt with different spheres and remained cognitively dissonant. It was, he insisted, a mischievous error to seek to divide Scripture and science, and separate the deep mysteries and important truths of revealed religion from the rich treasures of philosophy which God has provided for our instruction. And so, to preserve the accuracy of Mosaic primeval history in the face of revelations from ethnology, MacAusland turned to the pre-Adamite. The findings of the geologists, historians, archaeologists, philologists, and ethnologists all came within this purview and pressed him to concede that if Adam was to be taken as the progenitor of all mankind, the chronology of the Old Testament would have to be abandoned, and all that is written in the Book of Genesis of antediluvian members of his family must be treated as the fanciful speculations of some visionary mythologist. Happily, such a judgment would be too precipitate, for the biblical Adam was only the last of a series of human types that God had created. Superior to his forebears, Adam's appearance ex nihilo in the image of God was recorded for all posterity, although in a short time the pure Adamic line would be sullied through intermarriage with pre-Adamite stock. In MacAusland's case, as earlier with Lane, the pre-Adamite theory was engaged to safeguard the integrity of Scripture from the assaults of higher critics, a quite remarkable reversal of its earlier deployment as a source of skepticism. MacAusland's rhetorical strategy was to review the scientific state of affairs in a number of scientific specialisms, geology, ethnology, anthropometry, archaeology, reserving the lion's share for developments in philology. Only then did he present his pre-Adamite scheme as the sole way of keeping the Bible in harmony with these advances. The text is laced throughout with racist interpolations, all boiling down to the superiority of the Adamic Caucasians and the inferiority of pre-Adamic stocks. But the major concentration was on linguistic evidence for a separate and superior Adamic language inserted into pre-existent uncivilized linguistic families. Using evidence from comparative vocabulary and grammatical forms, and distinguishing monosyllabic from inflectional systems, he urged a fundamental chasm between primitive Turanian languages and the later Iranian, or Indo-European or Aryan, family. The Japhetic component of this latter cluster branched out into European languages, while another stream developed Sanskrit, the most complete and polished of all the languages of the earth. The Semitic element incorporated Aramaic, Arabic, and Hebrew, whose speakers occupied a more circumscribed territory than that of their Japhetic counterparts. In McCausland's telling, the former family, the Japhetic, developed more advanced civilizations, while the Semitic branch took the most prominent part in the religious development of mankind. Taken together, these two communities of inflectional language speakers dominated the history of civilization and exhibited their superiority over those nations using agglutinate Turanian tongues, whose structure could be reduced to a mechanistic gluing or fixing words to the original roots. The superiority of the former linguistic systems reflected the perfection of Adamite language, the parent of the inflectional languages. It displayed no monosyllabic infancy, and never passed through an agglutinative stage because it was the result of divine creation. And this was the secret of the success of the Noachic dispersion. As superior language speakers, they easily broke up pre-Adamite social groups and came to dominate vast stretches of the globe. As McCausland explained, this was because the language which originated in Paradise attained a richness and luxuriance in vocabulary and grammatical structure that is not to be found in the mechanically framed languages of the Turanian pre-Adamite. Some of McCausland's readers certainly found his views persuasive. An anonymous contributor to Scribner's magazine, for example, juxtaposed McCausland's thesis to the Duke of Argyll's monogenetic primeval man, much to the former's advantage. To this commentator, there was no other way of protecting the Mosaic chronology from the challenge of deep anthropological time. Just as the Copernican system had eventually escaped the fangs of religious dogma, so, too, must the pre-Adamite. Bolstering his stance by exegetical attendance to the Genesis text, and by rehearsing criticisms of the climatic thesis, this writer insisted that the pre-Adamite theory provided good grounds for adhering strictly to the Bible narrative, while at the same time, accepting the theory that Adam was the progenitor of the Caucasian race only, whose history is related in that narrative. It also had the advantage of resolving long-standing difficulties, such as the differences between inflectional languages and the monosyllabic families, in language history, without resorting to the tactics of Bunsen, who, assuming the unity of mankind in Adam, was compelled to allocate much too early a date to the deluge. Another observer, Alice Wayne, writing for the Ladies' Repository on McCausland's later The Builders of Babel, was just as supportive and recommended his works to those inclined to waver in their religious belief. Not everyone, however, was convinced by such philological arguments. Writing from Montreal in 1880, John Campbell used his expertise in Native American languages to attack linguistic polygonism and the doctrine of a multiplicity of human protoplasts, or of many Adams, which the Frenchman, Isaac de la Peyriere, first brought prominently before the Christian world, and which found great acceptance in America some years ago. Campbell painstakingly scrutinized the languages, customs, and religions of American Indians to disclose their proximity to Old World peoples, to undermine perceptions of them as incorrigible savages, and to expose the way in which American traders plunder them, and the American troops slaughter their defenseless old men and women. Another text originating in Ireland and marshalling pre-Adamite races to defend Genesis from the attacks of both natural science and biblical criticism appeared in 1876 under the pseudonym Nemo. Its purpose was simple: to establish that the existence of pre-Adamite human races was revealed in Scripture itself. Drawing on a wide range of writers such as the Duke of Argyll, William Herschel, William Thomson, Lord Kelvin, and the Dublin clergyman geologist Samuel Houghton, Nemo labored long and hard to confirm a Miller-style reading of geological history, and indeed wove a version of the astronomical nebular hypothesis into his reading of the Mosaic days of creation, 6 visionary stages that passed before the mental eye of Moses. The second day of creation, for example, spanned the Old Red Sandstone and Devonian, the Silurian, and the Cambrian epochs. But Nemo went well beyond Miller by integrating various species of early humans into the scenario. Paleolithic man, the anonymous writer noted, had come into being 350,000 years ago in a tropical climate with such creatures as the lion, tiger, and hyena. 50,000 years ago Neolithic man, remnants of whose tools were increasingly coming to light through recently excavated kitchen middens, was created alongside the reindeer and woolly rhinoceros. 6,000 years ago, alongside Neolithic humans, our Adam made his appearance, as did modern fauna and flora. Indeed, Nemo was even willing to countenance the possibility of human origins being traced back to the Miocene epoch and thus to preglacial times, and to thousands, or it may be a million of years, before the days of our Adam, to a time at which the Earth may have been fully inhabited with human beings, and with races afterwards swept away or destroyed during the rapidity of the drift of the glacial epoch. This staging of Paleolithic, Neolithic, and Adamic humanity, however, was not to be understood as an evolutionary development. Nemo made it clear that we have no account of the transformation of an ape into a man, nor any account of the commencement, progress or ending of such transformation. Let us therefore abide by the sacred history of the creation and descent of man. Crucial throughout was the distinction Nemo pressed between the appearance of earlier pre-Adamite human species and the genesis of what he called the special Adam, or our Adam, the father of the Jewish people, whose creation was consummated nearly 6,000 years ago. Each of these had its own biogeographical domain, with an associated range of settlement, fauna, and flora. The former world was inhabited by wild animals, the Adamic creation by domesticated creatures. And there was no doubt about the superiority of Adamic humanity over earlier human species, some of whom survived the local Noachian flood and continued in existence to the present day. The persistence of anthropometric characteristics bore witness to this history, and Nemo called upon the testimony of Poole to support his notions of racial fixity. All of this was reinforced by detailed exegesis of various Old Testament texts with the aim of defending Scripture from the higher criticism of Bishop Colenso. The pre-Adamite thus rescued Genesis from a two-pronged assault. First, it relieved readers of the need to reconcile the two accounts of creation in the Mosaic narrative, a task that had attracted great ingenuity, unfortunately misdirected, over generations. Second, it undercut the suggestion that the two stories were the products of different ancient traditions, expressed in the use of different divine names, Jehovah and Elohim, which had been spliced together by an editorial redactor. As an apologetic device, the pre-Adamite theory, rather ironically given its earlier role, was now being deployed to preserve scriptural reliability in the face of textual deconstruction. The difference between the two creations are pointed out by Colenso, who detects discrepancies between, as he thinks, two different accounts of the same transaction, instead of investigating them as the detail, first, of a general creation of mankind, and next, that of a fuller account of a particular race, made distinct from all the others by the Almighty, for a particular purpose. Where Colenso fancies he finds contradictions existing between the two chapters condemnatory of the historical veracity of the narrative, others deem them confirmatory of the Mosaic revelations in a remarkable manner.